This talk is titled The Anguish in the American Dream. And whether it's celebrated or condemned, the American dream endures, though I think always ambiguously. We are forever in this culture describing and defining and analyzing and assessing the concept. Yet with each attempt to clarify it, I think the idea of an American dream grows more incoherent, yet ever more entrenched. So I reviewed what I'm going to call the literature of dream analysis. There's a surprising number of books written with the American dream in the title. It appears that writers are endlessly thinking about achieving, saving, chasing, restoring, protecting, confronting, pursuing, reviving, shaping, renewing, and challenging the American dream. That's just part of the list of titles. Other writers are devouring, recapturing, fulfilling, chasing, liberating, advertising, redesigning, rescuing, spreading, updating, inventing, reevaluating, financing, redefining, remembering, and expanding the American dream. All of those taken directly from book titles. And we should never forget those who are deepening, building, debating, burying, destroying, ruining, promoting, tracking, betraying, remaking, living, regulating, undermining, marketing, downsizing, and revitalizing the American dream. This literature asks us to awaken from and face up to the dream as we explore the myths behind, crisis of, cracks in, decline of, and quest for the American dream. However, my favorite book title on this subject has to be Andy Kaufman, Wrestling with the American Dream, which explores the comedian's career, we're told, within a broader discussion of the ideology of the American dream. At least according to the book's publisher, the author, quote, brilliantly decodes Kaufman in a way that makes it possible to grasp his radical agenda beyond avant-garde theories of transgression. As an entertainer, Kaufman submerged his identity between a multiplicity of personas, enacting the American belief that the self can and should be endlessly remade for the sake of happiness and success. He did this so rigorously and consistently that he exposed the internal contradictions of America's ideology of self-invention, unquote. By the way, just as a footnote, after nearly 20 years as a professor, anybody who claims to decode and move into transgressive spaces, you can be guaranteed, has absolutely nothing to say of value. All right. So as we can see, writers are always eager to dive deep into the American dream, no doubt to find strikingly original insights, bold new interpretations, previously unexplored nuances. I, however, will take a different approach. I want to skate on the surface and state the obvious. Those of you who know my work know that's my specialty. Skating on the surface and stating the obvious. That is a strategy seldom employed, I believe, because such a reckoning with our past is bound to leave us uneasy with the present and terrified of the future. I think the strategy I want to employ leaves us in anguish. Now, I believe that to be fully alive today is to live with anguish, not for one's own condition in the world, but for the condition of a broken world. My anguish flows not from the realization that it is getting harder for people to live the American dream, but from the recognition that the American dream has made it harder to hold together the living world. So, our task tonight is to tell the truth about the domination that I think is at the heart of the American dream, so that we may more honestly face the brokenness of our world. Only then can we embrace the anguish of the American dream and confront our moment in history. So, let's start with the origins of this phrase, the American dream. A man named James Truslow Adams appears to have been the first to have used the phrase, the American dream, in print in his 1931 book called The Epic of America. This stockbroker turned historian defined the dream as, quote, that dream of a land in which life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, unquote. But he didn't reduce the American dream to materialism. and he emphasized U.S. social mobility in contrast with more rigid European class systems. Quote, "It is not a dream of motor cars and high wages merely, but a dream of social order in which each man and each woman shall be able to attain to the fullest stature of which they are innately capable, and be recognized by others for what they are, regardless of the fortuitous circumstances of birth or position." Adams was, in fact, quite concerned about the growing materialism of U.S. life, and he wondered about, quote, "the ugly scars which have been left on us by our 3 centuries of exploitation and conquest of the continent." Now remember, he was writing at the beginning of the Great Depression, coming off the go-go years of the 1920s. So, perhaps not surprisingly, his list of these problems may sound familiar to us, and I'll quote them at length. He asks, "How it was that we came to insist upon business and money-making and material improvement as good in themselves. How they took on the aspects of moral virtues. How we came to consider an unthinking optimism essential. How we refused to look on the seamy and sordid realities of any situation in which we found ourselves. How we regarded criticism as obstructive and dangerous for our new communities. How we came to think manners undemocratic, and a cultivated mind a hindrance to success, a sign of inefficient effeminacy. How the size and statistics of material development came to be more important in our eyes than quality and spiritual values. How in the ever-shifting advance of the frontier we came to lose sight of the past in hopes for the future. How we forgot to live in the struggle to make a living. How our education tended to become utilitarian or aimless, and how other unfortunate traits, only too notable today, were developed." A list that seems to be relevant to us today. Now, for all these concerns, Adams believed that the United States could overcome these problems as long as the dream endured, and that led him into the dead end of cliches. He says, "If we are to make the dream come true, we must all work together, no longer to build bigger, but to build better." For Adams, as the book's title makes clear, the story of America is an epic. And as he put it, the epic loses all its glory without the dream. But I want to argue that dreams of glory are bound to betray us. And 80 years after the question that he's posing, we must face whether the story of the United States is an epic or a tragedy. And I'll say more on that later. So, let's talk about the relationship of the American dream to domination. Adams' definition of the dream as the belief that life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone is rather abstract. So what do we really mean by the American dream? One historian who wrote a short history of the idea highlights the dreams of religious freedom, political independence, racial equality, upward mobility, home ownership, and personal fulfillment that run throughout U.S. history and define the dream. But a concept that is used by so many people over such a length of time for so many different purposes is never going to be easily defined. Rather than try to organize all that complexity, I want to focus on what has made the American dream possible. And I think that much is rather simple. The American dream is born of and maintained by domination. Now, by this claim, I don't mean that the American dream is to dominate, although, of course, many who claim to be living the American dream seem to revel in their ability to dominate. What I'm arguing instead is that whatever the specific articulation of the American dream, it is built on domination. I think this is the obvious truth on the surface, the reality that most dreamers want to leave out, perhaps because it leads to a rather painful question. How deeply woven into the fabric of U.S. society is the domination-subordination dynamic on which this country's wealth and freedom are based? So let's look at the American dream first, the American part. We all understand that the United States of America can dream only because one of the most extensive acts of genocide in recorded human history. when Europeans landed on this continent, the region that was eventually to include the United States, there were, of course, people here. Population estimates vary, but a conservative estimate is 12 million people north of the Rio Grande, perhaps 2 million in Canada, about 10 million in what is now the continental United States. By the end of the so-called Indian Wars, the 1900 census recorded 237,000 indigenous people left alive in the United States. Depending on the numbers you use, that's an extermination rate of somewhere between 95 and 99%. That is to say that the European colonists and their heirs, including me, successfully eliminated almost the entire indigenous population, or the merciless Indian savages, as they are labeled in the Declaration of Independence, of course, one of the most famous articulations of the American dream. That is to say, almost every Indian died in the course of the European invasion to create the United States so that we may dream our dreams. Millions of people died for the crime of being inconveniently located on land desired by Europeans who believed in their right to dominate. This American part of the dream goes on to include, of course, African slavery, millions of more people killed in the expansion of the dream. The domination is there at the beginning and continues to this very day. Well, second, let's talk about the dream part of the American dream. Now, Adams pointed out that while the American dream is always about more than money, the idea of getting one's fair share of the American bounty is also, I think, at the core of the American dream. That bounty, however, did not just drop out of the sky. It was ripped from the ground and drawn from the water in a fashion that has now left the continent ravaged, a dismemberment of nature that is an unavoidable consequence of a worldview that glorifies domination. From Europeans' first arrival, we have behaved as though nature must be subdued or ignored, writes the scientist Wes Jackson, who's one of the leading thinkers in the sustainable agriculture movement. As Jackson points out, our economy has always been extractive, even before the Industrial Revolution dramatically accelerated the assault in the 19th century, and the petrochemical revolution began poisoning the world more intensively in the 20th century. From the start, we mined the forest, soil, and aquifers, just as we eventually mined minerals and fossil fuels, leaving ecosystems ragged and in ruin, perhaps beyond recovery in any meaningful human time frame. All that, of course, was done by people who believed in their right to dominate. I think this kind of analysis helps us critique the naive notions of opportunity and bounty in the American dream. The notion of endless opportunity for all in the American dream is routinely invoked by those who seem unconcerned about the inherent inequality in capitalism, or those determined to ignore the deeply embedded white supremacy that expresses itself to this day in institutional and unconscious racism, which constrains indigenous, Black, Latino people in the United States. The notion of endless bounty in the American dream leads people to believe that because such bounty has always been available, that it will continue to be available through the alleged magic of technology. In America, the dreamers want to believe that the domination of people to clear the frontier was acceptable, and now with that frontier gone, the ever more intense domination of nature to keep the bounty flowing is acceptable. Now, of course, the United States is not the only place in the world where greed has combined with fantasies of superiority to produce horrific crimes, nor is it the only place where humans have relentlessly degraded ecosystems. But the United States is the wealthiest and most powerful country in the history of the world, and the country that claims for itself a unique place in history, the so-called city upon a hill, that serves, in the words of one of our Texas U.S. senators, as, quote, the beacon to the world of the way life should be. If you weren't aware of that. Texas, the beacon of the world, the way life should be. The American dream is put forward for all the world to adopt, but it clearly can't be so. Some of the people of the world have had to be sacrificed for that dream, as has the larger living world.